The following contains information given to me by the History of Cartography.
Greetings and welcome to the Mapcast, where we talk about all things related to map making. On this episode of Mapcast, we will be discussing the different ways that ancient cartographers made their maps, as well as some of the faults with their methods. We'll discuss the more old-fashioned ways of mapping, the evolution of cartography. To do that, we'll have to go back in time to 590 BC. Do you know the story of how they first measured how big the Earth is? So, there was once a man named Eratosthenes. He lived in Alexandria. There was a big library there. At one time, Eratosthenes was reading at the library, and he came across a book, a diary of a man who lived in Syene, a small town south of Alexandria. In the diary, he mentioned that on every June 22nd at noon, there were no shadows in Syene. Fascinated by this, Eratosthenes waited until the next June 22nd came around, and he measured the shadows that were cast in Alexandria. He found that they were cast at 7.2 degrees. Think about it this way. There's a circle. That's the Earth. On the far right, there's Syene. It lies on the Tropic of Cancer, and while the sun is directly over this imaginary line, it doesn't produce any shadows. Alexandria is on the circle, a little bit above Syene. There is a line going from the center of the circle to Alexandria and continuing, making an angle of 7.2 degrees against a parallel line. Now, because corresponding angles are equal when two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, the distance between Alexandria and Syene takes up 7.2 degrees of the whole Earth. So now, all Eratosthenes had to do was to measure the distance between Alexandria and Syene. To do this, he hired a footman to walk the distance, who found that it was approximately 575 miles. To put this into perspective, that's the distance from Portland to San Francisco. Now Eratosthenes multiplied the distance by the fraction of the circle that it took up, and found that the Earth was 28,750 miles in circumference, only overshooting by 10%. We will see soon that there were some errors in this method. Specifically, Eratosthenes assumed that all the sun's rays were parallel, and that his footman walked in a straight line. The ways that people navigated before maps were to look at the sky. Since the stars in the sky never moved, they could use their position to find the directions. The closest star is Proxima Centauri, which is 4.2 light years away. The fact that we can see it in the night is amazing, given that the size-to-distance ratio is about the same as seeing an ant in Seattle while standing in San Francisco. You're standing in San Francisco. You see an ant in Seattle. Just think about it. Since people were staring up at the sky all day, they came up with a system of distinguishing one star from another. They do look alike, and so they need to be distinguishable. People of the time would stare at the sky for hours on end, coming up with these constellations. For example, have you ever heard of the Big Dipper? As a challenge, try looking up at the stars tonight and creating your own constellation. What do you see in those stars? Be creative. Anyways, navigation by the stars was developed and based upon direct observation. In other words, there was no theory or philosophy that these maps were based upon, unlike some of the maps that we'll see soon. It was also developed for calendrical purposes. That is why units of time such as day, month, and year are based upon solar events. To understand the very first maps, we must first understand the people who created them. The first person we should consider, oddly enough, is Homer. He lived in 800 BC. He wrote the Iliad, among other things, and he is considered the father of geographical description, because of his description of Achilles' shield. But this isn't the type of map we were thinking of. According to Diogenes Laertius, Anaximander was the first to, quote, venture to draw the inhabited world on a map, end quote. He was inspired by the great philosopher, the father of philosophy, Thales, who also came up with the idea of similar triangles. Thales was also an excellent astronomer, able to predict eclipses and calculate the length of a year. Anaximander, who followed in the footsteps of Thales, was interested more in the technical aspect of these calculations. According to Strabo, He was the first to, quote, publish the first geographical map, end quote. In the ancient world, people hadn't explored much. They had no idea what America was, and also hadn't taken measurements as to how big, say, Africa was, much less know the shape of it. But these maps didn't need to be perfect. They just needed to do the job of navigating. We don't know much about how Anaximander drew his map, but it is thought to be based upon his astronomical map. This makes sense, since he was a very curious astronomer. His map is a circle with oceans along the circumference. Europe, Africa, and Asia are also on the map, all of approximately equal size. When the people of ancient Greece were sailing, say during the Persian War, in what direction did they know to go? Well, for starters, they used their astronomical mapping system. But when Anaximander came along, they began to carry what they called maps with them on stone tablets. Again, the maps didn't need to be perfect, they just needed to do the job. The map that Aristogoras carried with him, as he tried to conquer Naxos, was derived from the first one that Anaximander made. Remember that this was in 499, almost 100 years after Anaximander made his map. We saw that in the ancient days, there were some flaws in the way people mapped. Today, we have a completely different system, something that's called Google Maps. You might have heard of it. At least that's one of our mapping systems, but they all rely on the same basic principle. They use a number of satellites that are orbiting the Earth in the low Earth orbit, that is, 1,200 miles above the surface. These satellites take very high-resolution pictures of Earth as they go round and round. These pictures are of such high quality that the size of one pixel is a standard piece of paper. For perspective, that's the same as a camera in San Francisco being able to make out the eye color of a person in Los Angeles. Google then uses millions of these images and image recognition software to make out roads, rivers, and even the shapes of buildings to put into their user-friendly website where you can view all this information. They also use the pictures collected from Street View data to find the names of local businesses. We use this system instead of the old-fashioned system because it is more precise and we have the technology readily available. The potential applications of cameras of such high quality are almost endless, but one of the ways it will revolutionize the world is with self-driving cars. There are many companies trying to make self-driving cars, but they're doing it with sensors on the cars. They need these cameras to detect changes in traffic, where stoplights are, where construction is, and so on. However, the cost of each of these satellites is about $250 million. These companies don't have that money to spare. Plus, they would need about 10 satellites to get worldwide service. What they do instead is contract these photos from a company whose entire purpose is to take them. The idea is that the cost of these satellites is split up among all the different companies who want to use them. If these pictures are taken and sent to self-driving cars every 5 seconds, then the cars can maintain a constant awareness of their surroundings. And when all cars on the road are self-driving, then the cars can use advanced versions of machine learning to send different cars on different roads to prevent traffic. You might be the one to design this program. In this episode, we learned about how cartography started, who started it, and how it has changed in the present day. If you want more details, just rewind 10 minutes.